The year was 1922, and the Bavarian countryside was gripped by a winter that refused to thaw. Hinterkaifeck was a lonely farmstead tucked away between the dark, dense woods of the German interior. For the Gruber family, isolation was a way of life, but in the days leading up to the end of March, the silence of the farm began to feel heavy. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, had noticed strange occurrences. Footsteps in the attic, a set of footprints in the snow leading from the forest to the house, but none leading back. The local police from the nearby town of Schrobenhausen would later find a scene that defied logic. But before the discovery, there was only the atmosphere of creeping dread. Andreas had told neighbors about a set of keys that had vanished and a newspaper found on the porch that no one in the family had ordered. The farm was a labyrinth of cold stone and creaking timber, where every shadow seemed to hold its breath. Inside the farmhouse, the air was stagnant. The family, Andreas, his wife Kazelia, their widowed daughter Victoria, and her 2 children, lived under a roof that had become a trap. On the night of March 31st, one by one, the family members were lured into the barn. The police report would later describe the efficiency of the killer, who used a pickaxe, a tool of the earth turned into a tool of slaughter. But the true horror for the police was not just the act itself, but what happened after. For 3 days after the murders, the farm remained active. Smoke continued to rise from the chimney, neighbors saw lights moving in the windows, the cattle were fed, and the table was used. The killer didn't flee, he moved in. He lived with the bodies of his victims, hidden in the shadows of the attic, watching the world through the cracks in the floorboards. When the bodies were finally discovered by neighbors who became suspicious of the family's absence from church, the police were met with a scene that looked like a macabre stage play. The victims were stacked in the barn, covered with hay and an old door. The investigation was a nightmare of dead ends. Every suspect had an alibi, and the motive seemed non-existent. The detectives walked through the rooms of the farmhouse, finding half-eaten meals on the table and beds that had been recently slept in. The killer had been a ghost in the machine, a predator who preferred the intimacy of his victim's home to the safety of the woods. The police files grew thick with testimonies of strange noises and missing items, but the identity of the person who stayed for 3 days in a house of the dead remained a void. As the weeks turned into months, the Hinterkaifeck farm became a place of local legend. The police returned multiple times, even tearing down the house in search of hidden compartments or clues. They found nothing but more questions. The heads of the victims were even sent to Munich for clairvoyants to examine, a desperate move by a police force that was losing its grip on the reality of the case. The woods around the farm seemed to close in. The police interviewed over 100 suspects, but the shifting political landscape of post-World War I Germany and the sheer brutality of the crime made a resolution impossible. The file was never closed, but the names of the victims faded into the annals of cold cases. The farm was never rebuilt, leaving only a small shrine and the memory of the footprints that never led back. In the end, the Hinterkaifeck case became the blueprint for the modern home intruder horror. It was the realization that the most dangerous place isn't the dark forest or the open road, but the attic above your head or the cellar beneath your feet. The police records remain a haunting archive of a killer who wasn't just a murderer, but a guest who refused to leave. Even today, the case is debated by modern detectives using forensic technology on old reports, but the truth is buried under a century of snow and silence. The mystery of who fed the cows and kept the fire burning while the family lay in the barn is a question that will never be answered. The line between the living and the dead at Hinterkaifeck was blurred for 3 long days, and the police were left only with the echoes of a tragedy. Los Angeles in 1985 was a city under a different kind of sun. It was a summer of record-breaking heat where the air felt like a physical weight and the nights offered no relief. But as the temperature rose, so did a sense of primal fear. A predator was moving through the sprawling suburbs, entering homes through unlocked windows and sliding glass doors. The police called him the Night Stalker, a name that reflected his ability to vanish into the hazy, neon-lit labyrinth of the California nights. The LAPD was facing a nightmare. Unlike most serial killers, this one had no pattern. He attacked men, women, and children. He used guns, knives, and his bare hands. The only constant was the entry point, a window left open to catch a breeze that never came. Detectives Frank Salerno and Gil Carrillo worked out of a cramped office, surrounded by maps of the city marked with red pins that seemed to appear faster than they could track them. The fear in the city was palpable. Hardware stores ran out of deadbolts. Guard dogs became the most prized possessions. People slept with shotguns beside their beds and the lights turned on. The Night Stalker, later identified as Richard Ramirez, left behind scenes of ritualistic horror that baffled the police. He drew pentagrams on walls and forced victims to swear to Satan. It wasn't just murder, it was a desecration of the domestic sanctuary. Police forensic teams spent hours in the sweltering crime scenes, dusting for prints that were never there. Ramirez was a ghost, moving through the valley and the hills with a terrifying fluidity. One of the few pieces of evidence the police had was a single shoe print left in the dust of a flower bed, a rare Avia sneaker that would eventually become a key piece of the puzzle. As the body count rose, the pressure on the police department became explosive. Every patrol car in the city was on high alert, their spotlights cutting through the smog as they cruised the quiet cul-de-sacs. The sound of police helicopters, the birds of the LAPD, became the lullaby of Los Angeles, a constant, rhythmic thumping that reminded everyone that a monster was among them. The breakthrough didn't come from high-tech forensics, but from a stolen car. A witness had spotted a suspicious vehicle near a crime scene, and the police found it abandoned. Inside, they discovered a single fingerprint on the rearview mirror. The newly installed Automated Fingerprint Identification System, AFIS, whirred for hours before it spat out a name: Richard Ramirez. The police didn't have to hunt him down. The city did it for them. Ramirez's face was plastered on the front page of every newspaper and broadcast on every television station. When he attempted to hijack a car in East LA, the residents recognized him. They didn't wait for the police. They chased him through the streets, cornering him in a fury of vigilante justice. By the time the police arrived, the Night Stalker was a broken man, cowering from a mob that had reached its breaking point. The arrest was a media circus, but inside the precinct, the detectives felt only a grim exhaustion. The summer of fear was over, but the scars on the city's psyche were permanent. The trial would reveal a man who reveled in his evil, a figure of dark charisma who mocked the court. In his jail cell, Ramirez left behind more symbols of his obsession. The police found drawings and notes that hinted at a mind completely untethered from human empathy. Even behind bars, he remained a figure of dark fascination, receiving thousands of letters from women captivated by his rebel persona, a disturbing postscript to a case of pure predation. Richard Ramirez died of natural causes on death row decades later, never showing a moment of remorse. The Night Stalker case changed how people lived in California. The era of leaving doors unlocked and windows open was gone forever. The police files were eventually archived, but for the detectives who walked those bloody hallways in the heat of 85, the smell of the smog and the sound of the helicopters would always bring back the memory of the man who hunted in the dark.
Mayday, Mayday, criminal.
The Atlantic Ocean in December of 1872 was a vast, unforgiving desert of gray water and salt. When the crew of the De Gratia spotted a brigantine drifting erratically between the Azores and Portugal, they didn't expect a crime scene. They expected a ship in distress. But as they pulled alongside the Mary Celeste, they were met with a silence that was more terrifying than any storm. The ship was sailing under short canvas, its movements ghost-like and aimless. When the boarding party stepped onto the wooden deck, they found a vessel that was perfectly intact, yet completely devoid of life. The subsequent investigation by the British Vice Admiralty Court in Gibraltar would become a masterclass in forensic frustration. The ship's captain, Benjamin Briggs, his wife, their 2-year-old daughter, and a crew of 7 had vanished into thin air. There were no signs of a struggle, no bloodstains on the deck, no scorched wood from a fire, and no evidence of a mutiny. The police and naval investigators who walked the ship found the crew's personal belongings, their pipes, their boots, and their waterproof clothing, still neatly tucked away in their lockers. The most baffling element for the investigators was the state of the galley. A pot of stew was found on the stove, and the table was set for a meal that would never be eaten. The ship's log was found in the mate's cabin. The last entry was dated 10 days prior, placing the ship nearly 400 miles away from where it was found. Between that final ink stroke and the moment the De Gratia arrived, something had occurred that forced 10 people to abandon a perfectly seaworthy ship. The official inquiry focused on the cargo, 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol. 9 of the barrels were found to be empty. This led to a theory of vapor explosion, the idea that the fumes had leaked and the captain, fearing an imminent blast, ordered everyone into the single lifeboat. But investigators found no charring on the barrels and no smell of fire. The lifeboat itself was missing, its lashing cut cleanly with a sharp blade. The Attorney General of Gibraltar suspected foul play. He looked for a smoking gun in the form of a sword found under the captain's berth. He claimed there were bloodstains on the blade, but a later chemical analysis proved the stains were merely rust. The investigation turned into a series of dead ends. If it was a pirate attack, why was the valuable cargo and the crew's gold left untouched? If it was a mutiny, where was the body of the captain? As the weeks passed, the Mary Celeste became a phantom of the press. Every port in the world was on the lookout for a small lifeboat carrying a captain and his family, but the ocean remained silent. The investigators returned to the ship's log, searching for clues in the weather reports. They found nothing but mentions of heavy weather and fair winds. The ship was a locked room mystery on a global scale. The mystery deepened when the investigators examined the ship's bow. They found 2 strange grooves cut into the wood just above the waterline. Some believed it was evidence of a collision, while others thought it was part of a bizarre insurance fraud scheme. But the grooves, like everything else on the Mary Celeste, provided more questions than answers. The police files grew, with testimonies from sea captains and scientists, each offering a theory: sea quakes, giant squids, or even a sudden waterspout. But the physical evidence refused to fit any of them. The crew of the De Gratia, who had brought the ship into port, were treated with suspicion. The court wondered if they had murdered the crew of the Mary Celeste for the salvage money. The investigation turned into a trial of character, but with no bodies and no evidence of violence, the court was forced to release them with a fraction of the payment. The shadow of doubt hung over the case for decades, a stain on the reputation of everyone involved. The Mary Celeste was eventually put back into service, but she was considered a cursed ship. She changed hands 17 times, suffering a string of accidents and deaths before being intentionally run aground in Haiti for insurance money in 1885. The final crime committed on her decks was a simple act of fraud, far less mysterious than the vanishing of 1872. The police files of the Mary Celeste remain one of the greatest archives of the unexplained. There is no closure, no final arrest, and no grave for the 10 souls who disappeared. The case serves as a reminder that even with a ship full of evidence, the truth can be swallowed by the horizon. The Atlantic kept its secret, leaving the investigators with nothing but a drifting ship and the sound of the wind in the rigging.